There exists within the masculine psyche a form of communication so profound, so psychologically complex, that it operates through the complete absence of words, creating what Jung identified as one of the most misunderstood aspects of masculine psychology: the strategic, protective, and often desperate use of silence as the primary language for expressing what cannot be spoken directly. When a man goes silent, he is not simply withholding communication. He is communicating in the most powerful way his psychology knows how, using the absence of words to convey what the presence of words would make too dangerous, too vulnerable, or too threatening to his carefully constructed emotional defenses. Jung understood that masculine silence operates as what he called negative communication, the conscious or unconscious use of non-communication to communicate complex emotional states, psychological conflicts, and relational dynamics that direct expression would make unbearably vulnerable. This silence is not empty but full, not passive but active, not absent but intensely present in its very absence. To decode masculine silence, we must understand that we are not dealing with the lack of something, but with the presence of something so overwhelming that it can only be expressed through its opposite. The first type of masculine silence Jung identified is what I call processing silence, the withdrawal that occurs when a man's psychological system becomes overwhelmed by emotional complexity that exceeds his capacity for immediate integration. Unlike feminine psychology, which often processes emotions through verbal expression and relational sharing, masculine psychology typically requires solitary contemplation, internal analysis, and what Jung called descent into the unconscious, to make sense of emotional experience that threatens to destabilize his sense of identity and control. This processing silence is not rejection or punishment, but psychological necessity. When a man encounters emotional situations that challenge his understanding of himself, his relationships, or his place in the world, his psyche automatically initiates what Jung called introversion, a turning inward that allows for the deep psychological work of integration. During this silence, he is not avoiding you. He is trying to understand what you mean to him, what your relationship means to him, what your presence in his life is doing to his internal landscape. The second type is what Jung would recognize as defensive silence, the strategic withdrawal that occurs when a man perceives threats to his psychological autonomy, his emotional control, or his masculine identity. This silence serves as what I call psychological armor, protecting him from situations that might require him to admit vulnerability, acknowledge emotional dependency, or reveal the depth of his feelings in ways that feel dangerous to his survival. Defensive silence often emerges when conversations move into territory that threatens his sense of independence or control. Topics about feelings, future commitment, relationship definitions, or emotional needs can trigger this type of silence because they require him to acknowledge aspects of himself that his conditioning has taught him are dangerous to reveal. The silence becomes a way of avoiding conversations that might lead to emotional exposure that feels too threatening to risk. The third type Jung identified is what I call overwhelm silence, the psychological shutdown that occurs when a man's emotional system becomes flooded beyond his capacity to process, understand, or respond appropriately. This is not conscious choice, but unconscious protection, his psyche's way of preventing complete psychological disintegration when emotional intensity exceeds his ability to maintain equilibrium. This type of silence often follows intense emotional conversations, relationship conflicts, or moments of unexpected intimacy that activate feelings he doesn't know how to handle. His silence is not rejection of the experience, but an attempt to create the psychological space necessary to integrate what has happened without losing his sense of self in the process. The fourth type is what Jung called Anima silence, The profound quiet that occurs when a man's anima, his inner feminine, has been activated by deep love or attraction but cannot be integrated with his conscious masculine identity. This silence carries enormous psychological weight because it represents his struggle to reconcile his capacity for emotional depth and relational connection with the masculine conditioning that has taught him these qualities are threats to his identity. When a man goes silent due to anima activation, he is often dealing with feelings so intense and transformative that they threaten his understanding of who he is. The woman who triggers this silence has activated his capacity for love, vulnerability, and emotional depth in ways that feel both thrilling and terrifying. His silence is not indifference, but the opposite. It's the result of feeling so much that he doesn't know how to express it without risking psychological annihilation. The fifth type of masculine silence Jung identified operates through what I call communication by absence, the strategic use of withdrawal to convey messages that direct communication would make too vulnerable or risky to express. This silence carries specific meanings that can be decoded if we understand the psychological context in which it occurs. When a man suddenly becomes unavailable after periods of intense connection, he is often communicating through absence what he cannot communicate through presence. This communication by absence might express, "You've become too important to me, and I need to re-establish emotional distance before I lose myself completely." Or, "I'm afraid of the intensity of what I'm feeling and need space to understand it before I do something irreversible." Or even, "I want you so much that I'm terrified of rejection, so I'm withdrawing before you can reject me." The silence becomes a complex message system that protects him while simultaneously communicating the depth of what he's protecting himself from. Jung understood that this type of silence serves what he called the approach avoidance function. The man is simultaneously drawn to deeper connection and terrified of it, creating a psychological conflict that can only be resolved through the apparent paradox of expressing desire through withdrawal. The more important you become to him, the more likely he is to use silence as a way of managing the terror of potential loss. The sixth type manifests as what Jung called integration silence, the deep quiet that occurs when a man's psychological system is reorganizing itself around new emotional realities that require fundamental changes in his self-understanding. This silence is not avoidance, but profound internal work, the psychological equivalent of a snake shedding its skin or a butterfly forming in its chrysalis. And during this silence, he is not the same person who entered it, and he cannot emerge until the transformation is complete. Integration. Silence often follows significant relationship milestones, declarations of love, sexual intimacy, meeting family members, discussions about future, experiences that require him to reorganize his identity from single person to person in relationship, from independent individual to someone whose well-being is intertwined with another's. This reorganization cannot be rushed or interrupted without damaging the psychological process that's occurring. The seventh type Jung identified is existential silence, the profound withdrawal that occurs when relationship experiences trigger deeper questions about meaning, purpose, identity, and mortality that the man has been avoiding. Love and deep connection often activate what Jung called the religious function, the human need to understand our place in the larger cosmos, our purpose, our mortality, our connection to something greater than ourselves. When a man goes silent due to existential activation, he's often grappling with questions like, what does it mean that I need someone this much? How does loving her change who I am? What am I supposed to do with these feelings that are bigger than anything I've experienced? How do I integrate this experience with everything I thought I knew about myself? This silence is not relationship-specific, but life-specific, triggered by relationship, but extending far beyond it. The eighth type operates through what I call fear silence, the complete communication shutdown that occurs when a man's deepest terrors about relationships, vulnerability, and emotional dependency are activated. This silence protects him from conversations, admissions, or emotional experiences that might confirm his worst fears about what love costs, what relationships require, or what vulnerability leads to. Fear silence often emerges around specific triggers that activate his core wounds. Fear of abandonment creates silence around commitment. Fear of engulfment creates silence around future planning. Fear of inadequacy creates silence around emotional expression. Fear of rejection creates silence around declaration of feelings. The silence becomes a way of avoiding the confirmation of fears that feel too dangerous to risk confronting. Jung recognized that silence is often the most difficult to decode because it disguises terror as indifference, profound caring as casual disregard, desperate need as casual want. The man using fear silence often appears most distant when he feels most connected, most casual when he cares most deeply, most unavailable when he most wants to be available. The ninth type Jung called responsibility silence. The withdrawal that occurs when a man recognizes that his feelings for you have reached the level where they require action, decision, or commitment that feels overwhelming in its implications. This silence represents his attempt to avoid reaching the point where his feelings demand expression, where his love requires acknowledgement, where his attachment necessitates choice about the future. This type of silence often emerges at relationship turning points, where continued connection would require him to take responsibility for his feelings and their implications. Rather than move forward into greater commitment or clarity, he retreats into silence that allows him to maintain the status quo while avoiding the responsibility that deeper connection would require. The 10th type of masculine silence Jung identified operates through what he called shadow projection silence, the withdrawal that occurs when a man begins to see in you or in the relationship qualities that activate his own disowned psychological material. This silence serves as protection from confronting aspects of himself that he has rejected, denied, or buried in his unconscious. When your presence or the dynamic between you begins to mirror back his own capacity for neediness, emotional intensity, or vulnerability, he may retreat into silence to avoid this unwanted self-recognition. Shadow projection. Silence often emerges when the relationship becomes a mirror that reflects parts of himself he's not ready to acknowledge. If he has rejected his own capacity for dependency, your need for him might trigger silence. If he has denied his own emotional intensity, your passionate nature might create withdrawal. If he has suppressed his own vulnerability, your openness might activate protective silence. The silence becomes a way of avoiding the confrontation with disowned aspects of himself that your presence makes unavoidable. Jung understood that this type of silence is often accompanied by subtle criticism or judgment of the very qualities in you that represent his own shadow material. He might become critical of your neediness when his own need feels threatening, or judge your emotionality when his own emotions feel overwhelming. The silence protects him from recognizing that what he's rejecting in you exists within himself. The 11th type manifests as what I call identity crisis silence, the profound withdrawal that occurs when love or deep connection threatens his entire sense of who he believes himself to be. This silence emerges when the relationship challenges fundamental aspects of his self-concept, his independence, his emotional control, his masculine identity, his life plan, or his understanding of what he wants from relationships. This identity crisis silence often occurs when a man realizes that being with you would require him to become someone different than who he thought he was, more vulnerable, more emotionally available, more committed, more willing to prioritize relationship over other goals. The silence represents his attempt to avoid the psychological death and rebirth that such transformation would require, the terrifying prospect of letting go of who he has been in order to become who love is calling him to be. Jung recognized that this type of silence is often the most prolonged and confusing because it represents a fundamental psychological crisis that cannot be resolved quickly. The man is essentially asking himself, am I willing to die to who I have been in order to be reborn as who this love requires me to become? This is not a question that can be answered easily or quickly, and the silence protects him while he grapples with implications that feel larger than the relationship itself. The 12th type Jung called spiritual silence, the profound quiet that emerges when love activates what he called the religious function and confronts the man with experiences of transcendence, unity, and meaning that his rational mind cannot process or understand. This silence occurs when the relationship touches something sacred, numinous, or mystical that defies his normal categories of understanding and requires a completely different form of knowing. Spiritual silence often follows experiences of profound intimacy, physical, emotional, or psychological, that give him glimpses of unity, transcendence, or connection to something larger than himself. These experiences can be so overwhelming to his rational mind that silence becomes the only appropriate response, the only way to honor what cannot be spoken or analyzed, but only experienced and integrated slowly over time. This type of silence carries what Jung called numinous quality. It feels sacred, mysterious, charged with meaning that transcends ordinary communication. The man experiencing spiritual silence is often dealing with the recognition that what's happening between you has moved beyond the realm of ordinary relationship into something that touches the divine, the eternal, the archetypal dimensions of human experience. The 13th type operates through what Jung identified as trauma activation silence, the complete shutdown that occurs when current relationship experiences trigger unresolved wounds from his past that are too painful, threatening, or overwhelming to process consciously. This silence serves as psychological protection from re-experiencing trauma that current love has inadvertently activated. Trauma activation, silence might emerge when current intimacy triggers memories of past betrayal, when current vulnerability activates old abandonment wounds, when current love reminds him of previous losses that were too painful to fully grieve. The silence becomes a way of protecting himself from the full impact of traumatic memories that current experience has brought to the surface. Jung understood that this type of silence requires the most compassion and patience because it represents not resistance to current love, but protection from past pain that current love has accidentally awakened. The man is not rejecting present connection, but shielding himself from past wounds that present connection has made freshly painful. The 14th and final type Jung identified is what I call transformation silence, the deep quiet that accompanies the psychological metamorphosis that occurs when love succeeds in calling forth the man's authentic self, his capacity for wholeness, his ability to integrate all aspects of his personality into conscious relationship. This silence is not protective, but generative, not defensive, but creative, representing the deep work of becoming who he is called to be through love. Understanding the different types of masculine silence is only the beginning of decoding what he's really communicating when he withdraws. Jung emphasized that psychological phenomena must be understood within their context to be accurately interpreted, and masculine silence is no exception. The timing of the silence, the triggers that precipitate it, and the contextual clues that accompany it provide essential information for understanding which type of silence you're encountering and what it's attempting to communicate. Jung identified what he called silence timing patterns that reveal crucial information about the psychological function the silence is serving. Processing silence typically follows emotionally intense conversations, relationship milestones, or experiences that require internal integration. If he goes silent after deep emotional sharing, sexual intimacy, or discussions about the future, You're likely witnessing his psyche's need to process and integrate what has occurred before he can respond authentically. Defensive silence, in contrast, often emerges before potentially threatening conversations rather than after meaningful experiences. If he becomes unavailable when you want to discuss feelings, define the relationship, or explore deeper commitment, you're encountering his unconscious protection against conversations that feel dangerous to his psychological autonomy. The timing reveals whether he's integrating what has happened or avoiding what might happen. Fear silence typically correlates with what Jung called approach milestones, moments when the relationship is moving toward greater intimacy, commitment, or emotional depth. The closer you get to touching his core vulnerabilities or requiring him to acknowledge the depth of his feelings, the more likely fear silence becomes. This timing reveals that the silence is protection against emotional exposure rather than lack of feeling. Integration silence often follows what Jung called identity disruption events, experiences that challenge his fundamental understanding of who he is or what he wants from life. These might include meeting your family, you meeting his, discussions about moving in together, or any experience that requires him to reorganize his identity from single person to person in relationship. The timing reveals that psychological reconstruction is occurring. Jung also identified crucial trigger patterns that help decode the specific message each silence carries. Anima silence is typically triggered by experiences of profound femininity, your vulnerability, your emotional depth, your intuitive wisdom, your nurturing nature, that activate his own suppressed feminine qualities. If his silence follows moments when you've been particularly emotionally open or relationally wise, he's likely dealing with anima activation. Shadow projection silence is often triggered by moments when you express qualities he has rejected in himself. Neediness, emotional intensity, vulnerability, or any behavior that mirrors his own disowned psychological material. If his silence follows your expression of needs or emotions, particularly if accompanied by subtle criticism of these expressions, you're likely encountering shadow projection. Responsibility silence typically emerges at decision points where continued relationship progress would require him to take concrete action, make commitments, or acknowledge the implications of his feelings. If silence coincides with natural relationship progression points, exclusive dating, meeting family, discussing future plans, he's likely avoiding the responsibility that next steps would require. Trauma activation. Silence often follows experiences that unconsciously remind him of past wounds, previous betrayals, abandonments, or emotional injuries. If his silence seems disproportionate to current circumstances or follows experiences that should be positive but trigger unexpected withdrawal, past trauma may be influencing present response. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called contextual behavioral clues that accompany different types of silence and provide additional information for accurate interpretation. Processing silence is often accompanied by what he called benevolent distance. He withdraws but maintains warm, caring energy when you do interact. He might text less, but when he does communicate, the quality remains affectionate and connected. Defensive silence, in contrast, often includes what Jung called protective coldness, not just withdrawal, but a quality of emotional unavailability that feels more rejecting than caring. The silence carries an edge of resistance or mild hostility that reveals its defensive function. Fear silence typically includes what I call anxious energy. Even though he's withdrawn, there's an underlying tension or restlessness that suggests internal conflict rather than peaceful processing. He might seem agitated when you do see him, or his silence might feel charged with unspoken emotion. Integration silence often carries what Jung called chrysalis quality, a sense that something important is happening beneath the surface, that the silence is productive rather than avoidant. There's often a quality of deep inner work occurring that feels mysterious but not rejecting. Spiritual silence typically includes what Jung called numinous presence. Even in withdrawal, there's a quality of sacredness or depth that suggests the silence is honoring something profound rather than avoiding something threatening. This silence often feels pregnant with meaning rather than empty of communication. Understanding these timing patterns, triggers, and contextual clues allows you to respond appropriately to his silence rather than simply reacting with anxiety, frustration, or attempts to force communication that his psychology isn't ready to provide. We arrive now at the most crucial threshold, learning not just to decode what his silence means, but how to respond in ways that honor the psychological function it's serving while maintaining your own emotional well-being and relationship needs. Jung emphasized that appropriate response requires understanding that masculine silence is not a problem to be solved, but a communication to be honored, not resistance to be overcome, but a process to be supported, not emptiness to be filled, but fullness that requires space to unfold. For processing silence, Jung would recommend what he called patient presence, giving him the time and space his psyche needs for integration, while maintaining subtle connection that lets him know you remain available when he's ready to emerge. This might mean reducing the frequency of contact without disappearing entirely, sending occasional supportive messages without demanding responses, maintaining your own life and activities while remaining emotionally available when he resurfaces. The key with processing silence is avoiding the temptation to interpret his withdrawal as rejection or to fill the silence with anxiety-driven communication that interrupts his internal work. Instead, you might send messages like, "Take all the time you need. I'm here when you're ready," or "Thinking of you and sending good energy." These communications honor his process while maintaining connection. For defensive silence, Jung would emphasize what he called safety creation, demonstrating through your response that you're not the threat his psyche perceives you to be. This often means stepping back from whatever triggered his defensive response, giving him space to feel safe again, and approaching the sensitive topic differently when he re-emerges. Pushing against defensive silence typically reinforces the defense and prolongs the withdrawal. The most effective response to defensive silence is often to address the underlying fear directly, but gently. "I sense I may have said something that felt threatening. That wasn't my intention. I'm here when you feel safe to talk again." This acknowledges his need for protection without taking responsibility for his defensive reaction. For fear silence, Jung would recommend what he called courage modeling, demonstrating through your own behavior that vulnerability is safe, that emotional expression is honored, that the fears driving his silence are not rational responses to current reality. This might involve sharing your own vulnerable feelings, expressing confidence in the relationship's ability to handle difficult conversations, or simply maintaining consistent, caring behavior that contradicts his fears. With fear silence, avoid reassurance that minimizes his fears. You shouldn't worry about that. And instead acknowledge the validity of his feelings while providing evidence that contradicts his worst-case scenarios. "I understand that opening up feels scary. I want you to know that whatever you're feeling is safe with me." For Anima silence, Jung would emphasize feminine honoring, responding in ways that celebrate rather than diminish the feminine qualities that triggered his withdrawal. This might mean continuing to express your emotional depth, intuitive wisdom, and relational intelligence, while giving him space to integrate these activated aspects of himself. The goal is to remain authentically feminine, while not overwhelming his capacity to handle anima activation. For integration silence, Jung would recommend what he called transformation support, recognizing that profound psychological change is occurring and requires time, patience, and space to complete. This is often the most difficult silence to endure because it can last longest, but it's also the most important to honor because it represents genuine growth and development. With integration silence, The most helpful response is often to focus on your own growth and development, trusting that his psychological work will unfold in its own timing. Messages like, "I'm excited to see who we're both becoming through this experience," honor the transformation without pressuring it. For spiritual silence, Jung would emphasize sacred witnessing, honoring the numinous quality of what's occurring without trying to rationalize, analyze, or rush the process. This silence often requires the deepest trust because it touches dimensions of experience that transcend ordinary relationship categories. For trauma activation silence, Jung would recommend compassionate patience, understanding that current love has activated old wounds and that healing cannot be forced or rushed. The most helpful response is often to provide consistent, non-threatening presence while allowing his psyche to process the activated trauma at its own pace. With trauma silence, avoid taking his withdrawal personally or trying to fix what's been triggered. Instead, communicate that you understand something painful has been activated and that you're willing to give him space to heal. "I can see that something difficult has come up for you. I'm here with love and patience while you work through it." For responsibility silence, Jung would emphasize pressure relief, demonstrating that you're not demanding immediate decisions or commitments that feel overwhelming to his system. This often means backing away from conversations about the future, expectations, or relationship definitions while maintaining your own clarity about what you want. Jung understood that the ultimate goal is not to eliminate masculine silence, but to create relationships where silence can serve its natural psychological functions without becoming destructive to connection. This requires what he called conscious relationship, partnerships where both people understand and honor each other's psychological processes, where silence is understood as communication, where space is recognized as sometimes the highest form of love. The most important principle Jung would emphasize is maintaining your own emotional center regardless of his silence. Your ability to remain whole, centered, and authentic while he processes whatever he needs to process creates the safe container within which his silence can serve its healing function and eventually give way to renewed connection and deeper intimacy. If you've been confused, hurt, or frustrated by his silence, if you now recognize patterns you've been misinterpreting or responding to ineffectively, then your transformation begins with shifting from reaction to response, from anxiety to understanding, from forcing to allowing. Subscribe to this channel if you're ready to develop the psychological literacy that transforms relationship confusion into relationship wisdom. Share this video with someone else who needs to understand that masculine silence is communication, not absence, and that the right response can heal rather than harm. And most importantly, practice this today. The next time he goes silent, pause before reacting. Ask yourself, what type of silence am I witnessing? What psychological function might this be serving? How can I respond in a way that honors his process while maintaining my own emotional well-being? His silence is not punishment, it's protection. It's not rejection, it's processing. It's not emptiness, it's fullness that needs space to unfold. Your understanding of what his silence really means gives you power. Your response to that silence determines whether it becomes a bridge to deeper intimacy or a wall between you. Stop taking his silence personally and start recognizing it as the complex psychological communication it actually is. Stop trying to force words from someone who's speaking in the language of absence. Start learning to hear what can only be communicated through the profound eloquence of therapeutic quiet.